I was thinking back over my career in the law profession for over half century now, and am reflecting on a few changes that I've seen and a few trends that I think are really detrimental to our society. My license says attorney and counselor at law. It doesn't say bureaucratic functionary. It doesn't say notary, notaire. It essentially to me means that I'm an advocate. But I'm an advocate for society and for the betterment of society and for the benefit of my clients and people that come to me. A lot of people, particularly in my area of practice, are really hurting when they come. I've had so far 76 clients die of violent death, which is quite a few for a trial lawyer. But I've also seen a lot of death and a lot of stress that's been unnecessary because we have a dumbass population and a dumbass group of administrators who all they care about is winning an election and not helping out their people or their subjects. It just amazes me when I think back on politics. In 1972, I ran for a countywide office, and I spent about $6,000 for a job that paid $30,000 a year. My opponent spent $110,000, and he won by 221 votes, and his job paid $30,000 a year too. Well, he was in office for a long time, but he would have to be to pay back or to make that expenditure worthwhile. One of the things that happened on that campaign is I advocated victim compensation. I think victims' compensation was quite necessary because it showed a lack or a failure of a system that cares about people injured by crime. It's my position that criminal courts are not a substitute for civil lawsuits, nor should prosecutors be a substitute for lawsuits, for civil judgments or whatever. But when I started harping about victims' compensation, my opponent took up the call, and he and a bunch of his friends ran through victims' compensation laws whereby the alleged criminal would compensate the victim. Now, it's been my experience both before and after law school, most criminals are poor. The majority of them are poor. Most of them commit crimes because they're poor, like Les Miserables. He stole bread for his nephews, and they put him in prison because he was a thief. So, how would you get somebody like that to pay restitution? It's delusional, and we pass these delusional laws in order to placate the frothy mouth public saying we're doing something for them, when in fact we're not. We're conning them. But if you can stand up in front of an audience and say, I'm for victims' compensation, we're going to make the victims pay, the same as our president saying we're going to have a wall built and paid for by Mexico. I mean, any thinking person knows that has to be bullshit. And I don't understand why they accept it. Anyway, my thought was that a government has to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of its citizenry. That's constitutional law, that's in Declaration of Independence. That's what we've inherited from the British. Well, providing for the health, safety, and welfare doesn't mean extorting some poor son of a bitch that's been convicted of a crime that has to go to the slammer and stick in a big judgment over his head the rest of his life so that the public can be placated that some politician running for district attorney is doing his job protecting the public. It angers me that any district attorney would think we're that stupid. What I had in mind was that we ought to have some form of compensation in the nature of workers' compensation, where somebody who's been the victim of a crime, whether it's economic or based in other areas, got reimbursed to some extent, where it wasn't an undue hardship and didn't put him in a suicide prevention cage. But we've got into this crime thing and punishment thing, and it's almost to the point of irrationality.
Okay.
50 years ago, I proposed that we have societal impact statements when we have legislation. How is this legislation going to affect our society? We have environmental impact statements, we have economic impact statements. Why not societal impact statements? Well, it's because the moneyed people running things don't give a damn about the individual people or the people. All they care about is how do we make a buck?
Come on.
And how do we save a
Come
buck?
on.
Well, we can save a buck by conning the people into privatization,
Oh, come on.
like privatizing prisons and things such as this, and selling them services. Well, this all fits together. Quiet! That was my bird and my parrot in the background. So, we have a situation, for instance,
Oh.
where there's a scandal during the Reagan administration with the Contras and the Iranians and trading guns for this, that, the other, and illegally mining a harbor, and a whole illegal war operation allegedly run by Oliver North. So,
Well, I know her.
everybody's claiming for Oliver North's head. Let's prosecute Oliver North. Let's get him for being a bad guy. Let's get him for violating the Boland Amendment. Well, that's bullshit. If I were in charge, I'd have granted him total immunity,
Okay, thank you.
because I know a lieutenant colonel can't have the power to run a whole goddamn war. And I'd say, okay, you're immunized, you go to jail until you tell us what's going on. Who was your director? Who put this up? Who put this in project? Whose idea was this? Who was really in charge? Who are you covering up for? Is it Poindexter or someone else? Now, you have immunity, you have a choice of answering, so that we can better our government. But prosecuting you doesn't make our government any better. So we're going to hold you in contempt of court until such time that you, as a public official, tell us, because of your obligation to the public, what the hell you did and why you did it and who was behind it. Now, we've got off on this prosecution shit to the point where it's irrational. Years ago,
Yeah.
a really good friend of mine, Churchill relative, was a psychiatrist. And he was treating this teenage boy for prevarication and various other things. And the teenage boy was pissed off because mommy brought in another husband.
Dr. Bird.
And he resented that because there was no possibility that Daddy would ever come home at that point. Well, he was having a hard time adjusting to the divorce and things like that. And like a lot of affluent parents, he was taken to a psychiatrist to get worked through some of the problems. Well, he was very, very angry, and he was pretty bright. So the next thing happens is that he came in the office one day, and his head was bleeding a little bit. And he said his stepfather had hit him over the head in a fit of anger with a tennis shoe, and the tennis shoe caused him harm, caused him to hurt, put him in pain, and it was a bad thing. So they talked about this for about an hour. My friend and client was convinced that since the guy was a proverbial liar and a manipulator, that he was trying to manipulate his mother and the new stepfather and get the stepfather in trouble and drive a wedge. Well, the kid then said something to a teacher at school. The teacher at school called social services, and the shit hit the fan. So they did a welfare check. They wanted to do an investigation, this, that, and the other. And my client said, I'm not going to violate patient-doctor privilege. So they subpoenaed him and they cited him for violation of a statute that makes it an obligation of a medical professional to cooperate with the government if there is an allegation of child abuse. Well, he'd been a psychiatrist for 25 years. He was the medical director of a mental hospital and a fairly prominent person. He had been head of psychological warfare at Fort Benning, or counter psychological warfare at School of Americas in Fort Benning. He treated a lot of people with super high security clearances. And he was being prosecuted for failure to report to a social worker. We had a lot of conversations about this because I was defending him. And first off, he pointed out that the people of Child Protective Services don't have the training that others with Masters of Social Work have, and all they are is record keepers. And all they want to do is punch little cards in the punch card and say, we investigated, etc. And then put the names on a registry. And he was insulted that they would challenge his professional abilities, etc., and have him judged by somebody that he essentially said was just out of kindergarten that was judging the way he was treating patients. So what happened is he wouldn't let me defend him. And he said, fuck them, I'm moving out of town. So I moved to an adjacent state and became the head of a penitentiary there, and then went to another state and retired in that state. And I think the state of Colorado lost a really, really good, helpful psychiatric scientist, because the statute said you got to report a child abuse, and not a child abuse, but an allegation of child abuse. Well, so the child then gets rewarded for manipulating his mother, causing the mother and father or stepfather to break up, and all kinds of good things like that. The psychiatrist moves out of town. He has a thing against his medical license. His wife's pissed off at him because they're moving, and a lot of disarray. This type of thing shouldn't happen. And the legislation is knee-jerk that causes this, not well thought out, and is generally interpreted by ambitious political figures, prosecutors, etc., as a way of gaining headlines and getting publicity and showing the public that they're doing their job, when in fact they're not. They're pandering to the public opinion. So there's this case in Boulder. An athlete on the football team goes out with some girl, and there's some hanky-panky going on. Nobody says really what it is. The girl goes in and talks to a counselor because there've been drinking involved and things like that. Well, the counselor was counseling about teenage drinking. A few months later, somehow, it came up that the athlete inappropriately touched the girl. So we have a bright-eyed young DA from the urban area of New York who understands more about manipulating press than he does about practicing law, and obviously knows nothing about sociology or criminology, and he files against two people. He files felony charge for sexual assault against the juvenile high school student, and then against the high school social worker for failing to report a child abuse case. So we have somebody who was trained as a counselor. She didn't report a case, and now she has to go to trial. Thankfully, she won the trial. But it got me thinking back in the days when I was in undergraduate and graduate school, dealing with the idea of counseling. And one of the big issues that we used to address in seminars was, can you be a counselor and a disciplinarian at the same time? How can you be a disciplinarian and get people to come in and talk to you about their problems if they know you're going to rat them off, turn them in, or they're going to be punished? Now, the thought back then was you couldn't. That was the idea behind the doctor-patient privilege, attorney-client privilege, counselor-patient privilege, etc. So none of us were made adjuncts to the police department. None of us were forced or compelled by law to rat off a client. And it was a good policy because we can't help people if they can't trust us. So I remember the first case that I had to deal with something like this. And LSD had just become illegal. And there were university students having bad trips. And there was a big campaign going on. If you're having a bad trip, go to the emergency room of the hospital and they'll treat you, they'll help you. They've set up operations to help. So, my client at the University of Colorado was the son of a doctor who practiced quite a long time. He was familiar with attorney-client and doctor-patient privileges, among other things. He was dosed with a little bit of LSD and freaked out, didn't know what was going on. But because the way he was brought up and in his environment, he went to the emergency room for treatment. Well, before he got treatment, the doctor there called the police. The police came in and interrogated him, and the doctor said he told me he was on LSD, and the police asked him about that. The next thing is that rather than getting treated, he's taken to the jail in handcuffs and put in a cell to freak out by himself in a cell because he admitted to a crime. Now, thankfully, I had this very conservative judge, and it was interesting because many of the liberals in Boulder didn't like the judge. But he was a man of integrity, and I respected him for that. He and I disagreed, and we disagreed openly, politically. But we respected each other. So we had a hearing on this case. And I argued that it's been my experience, it was my training, and the training of most of us that had any counseling training whatsoever, that you can't rat off your clients. It's a conflict of interest. And conflicts of interest are very important to attorneys. And we can't function if we have to rat off our clients, nor can doctors. Well, the judge agreed with me, and he dismissed the case, causing the DA to criticize him publicly and the police to criticize him publicly because they're whiners, and that's how we got in the position. And the law that we're in now, that whenever they hire the PR firms to whine for the law and order faction, nobody can stand up for logic, for common sense, for justice. So, until we start looking at those things and talking about societal impact, we're going to continue to be that way, because politics is now equated with power, and we're in a postmodern society where reality doesn't really count as much as projection or image. So it's time we start looking at the consequences of some of our policies and discuss them, and not just do a knee-jerk action. Let's protect the children, let's believe the children. What is our policy going to do to our society? And nobody's speaking to that, which pisses me off, frankly. And that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed my sermon. Thank you very much. Bye.